Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for the presentations. There's a lot going on today, but I'd like to ask a few questions of the IFA and Mr. Rush there, please. First of all, yesterday when we had the scientists in talking about and really putting, I suppose, a huge dose of reality into the conversation, one of the things Professor Kevin Anderson said is that there is no such thing as a universal we, that most people are not responsible for most emissions. And I suspect this applies equally to farmers. So when the IFA talks about farmers and farms on average and in general, I think you should qualify, or we should be able to qualify, where the real problem lies. And the figures on the cattle numbers are interesting, because you say in your submission that cattle numbers livestock numbers haven't actually risen, and you offset the huge increase in dairy cattle as against the beef cattle. But the CSO figures show that from 2010 to 2020, there's been a 46.4% increase in the dairy herd. That's almost 50%, you may as well say, just to average it out. And that isn't for all farmers, for the thousands of farmers who, as you pointed out earlier on, can't sustain or live a proper income with the farms that they have. So I think in that case, the IFA should be really welcoming changes to the way agriculture is run in this country. But of course, it is driven by the government itself. I work out of the Department of Agriculture, and this department, through Teagascan and Bord Bia, has deliberately driven up the cattle numbers, particularly in dairy, in order to, pardon the pun, beef up the export market. So we export a huge amount of cattle, and those exports, as you pointed out, are worth a huge amount of money. But it's not our biggest industry. The export of pharmaceuticals is actually where we export the most. Having said that, I would like to ask.
That's 2 minutes now, Deputy.
Go through, very quickly. When you go through the figures on dairy and cattle numbers, you then compare them to the rise in figures for vehicles by 75% in the same period, and Dublin airport passengers by 155%. And I just want to ask you, what's the point of that comparison? I mean, if we're dealing with the agricultural sector, we have to look at it in its own right, because it does stand out as being responsible for a huge amount of the emissions, and therefore needs to do a huge amount of the heavy loading. And I suspect that heavy loading needs to be done through looking at why we have this policy of exporting so much dairy and beef to benefit the likes of Goodman,
the question is clear, Deputy, so I'll go.
It is only a certain sector who are gaining from this policy. It is not all farmers.
Mr. Rush.
Would you comment on that discrepancy, please?
Mr. Rush, or one of your colleagues, if you want to take that, please.
Yeah, I might take the first part of it, and Director Policy type hopefully might come in there as well. I suppose first, in terms of to Deputy Smith's commentary around the we, and yeah, listen, Irish farming is diverse sectorially, diverse, diverse in terms of production systems, depending on where in the country you are. But there's one thing, like we have to look at what the increase in dairy production, what drove that, and the market signal drove that, and an opportunity for farmers to improve their income, drove that, and an opportunity to bring young people home and to farm drove that. And I think we need to be aware of the scale when we talk about Irish farming and intensity, where we lie in terms of scale. And the average herd size in Ireland is less than 100 cows. Pre-quota removal, it was 70. So I think it's just gone to maybe it's lifted 20, 25 cows per herd on average, okay? And what that 25 cows did was that allowed farmers to maybe employ someone to help them on their farm, which gave them a better quality of life. It allowed a family bring home a son or a daughter that otherwise didn't have a future in farming. And these are positives. And I'll always highlight the positives of agriculture, because I'm one of those farmers that has 2 young sons, a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old, and we're working towards making a future for them in agriculture. And no one is immune to change, and no sector is immune to change. And farming is no different. And we are changing. We're changing in terms of our practices on farm, in terms of fertiliser use, in terms of animal genetics, because we want to stay in business, Deputy Smith. We want to continue to contribute to our economy, and we want to continue to contribute to our towns and villages around the country. And that's not you know, if I wanted to be a millionaire, I'd go and do something else, but I don't. I want to be a farmer. I want to produce food, and I want to contribute to the social sustainability of the country as well, because that's what I believe in, and that's what most farmers believe in. And I take exception to the fact that farmers, and be they like dividing farmers up into large or small or whatever else, that's going to serve no one in this debate around climate action. And we're having that debate within agriculture. We're having it all the time. And we fully recognise that if we divide up and we start fighting among ourselves, we will achieve nothing. We are very serious about meeting our climate action targets. We are very serious about staying in business, and we're very serious in being here for the next generation. And we're solutions focused. And we're not in it to, you know, for Goodman or for exports or whatever else. We're in it to stay in business, and we're in it to stay, you know, to continue to do what we're doing. We're not intensive, as I said before. The average stocking rate on 60% of farms, the average stocking rate is 0.33 cows per acre. That is a very low stocking rate. And we're comparing ourselves to our international peers, be it Australia, America, Canada, Brazil. We are not an intensive producer. That's not to get away we don't have a challenge, and we don't have a significant challenge, but we're not, like, we're engaging with it. That's why we're here today, and that's why we continue to adopt the best research, engage with Teagasc, engage with anyone, anyone who has solutions. I'd just like to bring in Ty Buckley here for a second. Maybe he might clarify some of the figures there.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Buckley.
Thanks very much, Chairman. And so I suppose just on the deputy asked in relation to why we were quoting the figures relating to passenger numbers and cars. So the main reason was when we speak to farmers all over the country, particularly over the last 18 months, they feel completely scapegoated in terms of the commentary relating to the challenge we face. As the Deputy President, farmers, the vast bulk of farmers fully accept that they have a role to play here, but they feel that they're being unduly targeted in a lot of the commentary that has been in the media and other places over the past 18 months particularly. And simply what we wanted to do was to put it in context that absolutely we have a role to play, but there's that the numbers of that has happened in the growth in cattle numbers that has happened in Ireland is at a very, very small level. Over the past 30 years, whatever way you look at it, relative to other parts of the economy. We all know that, and we're not trying to put one sector against the other. We're trying to put it in context that we have a challenge, but it is not painted in the way that sometimes it's painted in relation to the growth that has happened in agriculture. If you look at the emissions from agriculture for 1990 versus 2019, they're more or less the same by EPA numbers. And if we speak about the growth in dairy, there was 30 years, there was milk quotas in place for dairy as well. So the growth that has happened over the last number of years simply was because of the fact that there was absolutely no growth for 30 years, where numbers actually fell continuously. So that was the reason that we wanted to put context to what has happened in relative size of the emissions that's coming from agriculture relative to other sectors, and also showing that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Buckley. We've lost the connection with Mr. Buckley.
If you look at the average dairy number.
Thank you, Mr. Buckley. No, I think you've answered the question.
5 years.
Thank you. The connection with Mr. Buckley has broken.
Thanks, Deputy.
There. Thank you. I see that Mr. Coughlin is indicating to come in on this question as well. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair, thank you. I don't want to go deep into this now, and first of all, it's worth acknowledging that it is true that until recently, agricultural emissions had not risen in the same way as, for example, transport emissions had, nor had they fallen in the same way electricity emissions had. But on the other hand, they have started to rise significantly over the last few years since the expansion of the dairy herd took hold with the removal of quotas. And the issue now is, we have this collective target and this collective obligation to reduce our total emissions by 50%. And the specific point I wanted to make was that, which I didn't get to make when I spoke earlier, but it's in our submission, is that when you look at the indicative, so let's say we accept, and the committee accepts and the Dáil accepts the overall carbon budget. As you know, the next step will be for the government to divide that up, that emissions cake or that pollution pie. And they've given us indicative emissions ranges for each sector. And the first thing to say is that, contrary to how maybe the public and certainly the IFA is presenting it, the agricultural sector is not being scapegoated. The plan is to give the agricultural sector the least demanding, they're still demanding, but the least demanding emissions reduction cuts of 22 to 30%, compared to 70 to 80% in electricity, and I think, if my memory serves, roughly between 45 and 55% around the average, therefore, for the other sectors. And what's worth noting about those emissions reductions, though, as well, is that according to the calculations done by Hannah Daly, who was in with you on Tuesday, unless every sector hits, or only if every sector hits the more demanding end of that emissions reduction range, will we meet 51%. So they're not really ranges. They're actually just an indication of how far the Department of the Environment has got so far in extracting proportionate, commensurate commitments from the individual line departments for the sectors, commensurate to the overall target.
Okay,
so basically,
thank you.
Those easier ends won't do. All sectors will have to do the higher end if we're going to meet the overall target.
Thank you very much.
And every tonne that isn't done by one sector will have to be done by some other sector.
Indeed.
The cake is now set, or will be set by this process.
Indeed, the point is made clearly. Thank you, Mr. Coughlin.